The narcissistic granddaughter stole all the elderly woman's savings and didn't know what would happen next. Imagine, an old woman who has worked hard all her life sits in a small house in a quiet Bavarian town. Her name is Weekend, 76 years old, with silver hair that she always ties back neatly. From the outside, her life seems unremarkable. No luxury, no travels to faraway lands, no great fortune. And yet, behind its walls lies a story that will change everything. Helga never had much, but she always had enough. As a young woman, she worked in a textile factory, and later she helped out at the local shop. She was frugal, almost overly cautious, and put aside every euro she didn't absolutely have to spend. These savings weren't just money. For Helga, they were a symbol, a piece of security, a small treasure she had built up over decades. Her days were quiet. In the morning, coffee at the old kitchen table, followed by a stroll through the market, a quick chat with neighbors. In the evenings, she enjoyed reading, sometimes listening to old records with the songs that had accompanied her as a young girl. She wasn't lonely. At least that's what she told herself, because every now and then her granddaughter came by, clear-toe visit. And these visits meant more to her than she wanted to admit. Clara was young, pretty, smart, and full of self-confidence. She carried herself as if the world belonged to her, and that was precisely what Helga secretly admired. Because in Clara, she saw more than just her granddaughter. She saw the family's future. Helga was proud that Clara was studying, that she was out with friends, that she seemed to be leading a modern, exciting life. Whenever Clara appeared, she brought energy into the house, spoke quickly and loudly, told stories Helga barely understood, and made the old woman feel like she was still part of something bigger. But there was something else in these visits, something Helga sensed but couldn't quite put her finger on. Clara could be charming, approachable, full of warmth, and the next moment, distant, critical, almost mocking. Sometimes she would remark on her grandmother's old-fashioned ways or the ridiculously small house. But Helga pushed these taunts aside. She thought, oh, that's just how young people talk. She only wanted to see the good, wanted to believe that Clara loved her. Over time, the visits became more frequent. Clara brought small gifts, a bouquet of flowers, a bar of chocolate, and talked about how stressful her life was, how expensive her studies were, how little her friends understood, how much she longed for security. And Helga, who had never learned to say no, not only opened her heart, but also slowly opened the door to something that was sacred to her, her savings. But nothing had happened yet. Helga still believed that trust would be rewarded, that her love would be reciprocated. She enjoyed the attention she received from her granddaughter and felt a sense of importance. At an age when the world seems to be spinning ever faster, she longed to be needed. And it is precisely here that a development begins that throws everything into disarray. While Helga continues her life in modesty, viewing her granddaughter's closeness as a gift, Clara inadvertently weaves a web of words, gestures, and intentions that will soon trigger a catastrophe. But how did it come to this? Why did Helga place her complete trust in this young girl, who sometimes seemed so kind, sometimes so cold? And what consequences would this belief have for the family? Be sure to stay tuned, because the true story is just beginning to unfold. What initially appears to be an ordinary bond between grandmother and granddaughter soon turns into a nightmare full of manipulation, pain, and betrayal. And at the same time, the beginning of an unexpected twist no one could have foreseen. Clara had learned how to win people over. Even as a child, she knew how to influence her parents and teachers with a smile, the right words, or even a fake tear. Now, as a young woman, she had perfected this art, and her grandmother Helga was an easy target. Because Helga was full of love, full of trust, and full of longing for closeness. At first, everything seemed harmless. Clara came often, sat at the kitchen table, and talked about studying in Munich, the high rents, the rising prices of books, and the constant fear of not having enough money. She spoke of fellow students who came from wealthy families, who received cars from their parents or had trips financed. "Sometimes I'm really ashamed," she said, lowering her gaze. "Everyone seems to have so much, and I only have you, Grandma." These words struck Helga right in the heart. She felt needed, almost indispensable. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she played an important role in the life of a loved one. And so she began slipping small amounts, a 20 here, 50 euros there. "Take it, child," she said, smiling. "You'll have it better than I did back then." But Clara didn't let it go. She quickly learned that her grandmother was willing to make sacrifices to help her, so she stepped up her game. She told stories of supposed debts, tuition fees, and rent arrears that she never actually had. With each new story, she increased the pressure, and every time Helga fell for it. It wasn't just words. Clara knew how to work with gestures. She hugged Helga tightly when she received money, sometimes even weeping and reassuring her, "You're the only one who believes in me." Then again she withdrew, appearing cold and dismissive when Helga hesitated. "It's okay," she would say with feigned indifference. "I'll find someone to help me." It was precisely this alternation between warmth and coldness that wore the old woman down. She wanted closeness, not distance, so she gave in. Again and again. Outwardly, everything seemed fine. Helga told neighbors how proud she was of her granddaughter and how hard she was studying. She kept quiet about the fact that she was now regularly withdrawing large sums from her account. She convinced herself it was just borrowed money. Clara would surely pay it back as soon as she finished her studies and found a job. But deep inside, something stirred. A faint doubt, a weak resistance. She noticed that Clara never really asked about her, that the visits revolved almost exclusively around money. But every time this thought arose, Helga felt ashamed. "How can you think so badly of your own granddaughter?" she told herself. "She loves you." The manipulation continued, step by step. Clara learned to exploit Helga's insecurities. She made little remarks about the house. "Grandma, your sofa is so old, my friends would throw it away." Or, "You don't understand online banking anyway. I'll help you with that. It's much easier." And indeed, after a while, she had access to Helga's account. "Just so I can help you make transfers," she explained. Helga, who distrusted technology anyway, allowed it, relieved that someone was taking care of it. What Helga didn't know, with every click, with every transfer, more of her hard-earned savings flowed into Clara's hands. At first, small amounts that barely registered, then larger sums, which Helga was told upon inquiry, "This is for the semester fee, Grandma. I had to buy a textbook, which was very expensive. The deposit for my new apartment, otherwise I wouldn't have a place to live." And Helga? She nodded, she believed, she repressed it, because believing the opposite would have meant accusing her own granddaughter of lying and deceit. She couldn't do that. Months passed, during which the old woman's trust was increasingly exploited. Helga's account slowly but inexorably emptied. Clara, on the other hand, enjoyed the new money. Expensive clothes, excursions, restaurant visits, all hidden behind the image of the poor student who was supposedly struggling to survive. But how long could this game continue? How long could Helga suppress her doubts before the truth became impossible to ignore? This is precisely where the rift begins. As Clara grows increasingly self-confident and believes she has her grandmother completely under control, the moment approaches when the mask falls, a moment that will shatter Helga's life and change Clara's world forever. Stay tuned, because in the next installment, you'll learn how the facade crumbles and Helga realizes the cruel truth. A truth that not only breaks her heart, but calls her entire existence into question. It was a grey, late autumn morning when Helga first sensed something was wrong. She had emptied her mailbox as usual, put away bills and junk mail, and then wanted to take a quick look at her bank statement. She was used to keeping a careful eye on her finances, even though Clara had been doing so much for her lately. With trembling hands, she slid the card into the ATM. But what she saw next made her heart stop. The account she had built over decades with patience, diligence, and countless sacrifices showed a nearly empty balance. Only a tiny amount remained. Helga blinked as if she'd made a mistake, pressed the keys again, and pulled out the statement. But no, it was the truth. Transfers at regular intervals, large sums, again and again. And the recipient, her own granddaughter, Clara. A feeling of dizziness overcame her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to sway. She stood paralyzed in front of the ATM until an impatient voice behind her said, "Are we going to continue?" Helga backed away, stuffed the papers into her bag, and hurriedly left the bank. The air outside was cold, but inside she was burning. She wanted to call Clara immediately, but her fingers were too stiff, her head too confused. So she went home, sat down at the kitchen table, and spread out the bank statements. Every item was a stab in the heart. She remembered the stories Clara had told her about rent, books, fees, all lies. Every number on that piece of paper was proof of betrayal. Helga couldn't sleep the next night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she could have been so blind. Had she really not noticed anything? Had her granddaughter's remarks, her mocking smile, her sudden mood swings meant nothing? Helga didn't just feel robbed. She felt used, mocked, even discarded. The next day, she sought out a conversation. She called Clara and asked her to come over. Clara appeared confident as always, with that smile that had soothed Helga so many times. But when Helga placed the bank statements on the table, her expression froze for just a split second. Then she shrugged. "Grandma, you're exaggerating. I told you I needed help. You gave me the money." "Given?" Helga's voice trembled. "These are my savings. I've worked for this my whole life. And you just take everything?" Clara sighed as if she were speaking to a stubborn child. "Grandma, honestly, you don't understand. Money is there to be used. What good is it to you if it just sits in your account? I'm young. I need it now. You don't anymore." These words struck Helga deeper than any blow. Not you anymore. As if her life were over. As if she no longer had any value. In that moment, she realized that her granddaughter hadn't acted out of necessity, but out of calculation, coldness, and selfishness. The days that followed were the hardest of Helga's life. She tried to talk to her neighbors, but most just shook their heads. How could you be so gullible? Some said it quietly, others directly. In their eyes, she was a naive old woman who allowed herself to be exploited by her own granddaughter. Helga felt exposed, without protection, without dignity. In stores, she avoided people's gazes. She felt like everyone knew about it. Everyone was laughing at her. Even at the doctor's, when she briefly mentioned the topic, all she heard was a pitying, "Oh, Mrs. Meyer, you need to be more careful," as if she deserved it. Worst of all, however, was the silence in her own house. Helga had once looked forward to Clara's visits. The room seemed brighter when her granddaughter was there. Now it was quiet, oppressively quiet. She went from room to room as if searching for something long lost. Her heart was heavy, her eyes filled with tears, and yet she didn't want to cry. She wanted to be strong, but she couldn't. At times she wondered if it wouldn't be better to forget everything. Simply remain silent, accept the humiliation, and spend the rest of her days as modestly as possible. But then she saw the bank statements again in black and white, and the feeling of humiliation returned, sharper than before. Clara hardly contacted her anymore. Occasionally, she sent a short message. "I'm busy." No time. Not a word of remorse. Not a sign of sympathy. For Helga, this was like final proof. Her granddaughter had cheated her not just out of money, but out of her dignity, her role as a beloved grandmother, her trust in the family. And yet, as deep as she had fallen, as heavy as the humiliation weighed on her shoulders, something stirred within Helga. A spark, a thought, still faint, but growing stronger with each hour. Was this really the end? Should she really resign herself to being destroyed, betrayed, and laughed at? Helga didn't know. Not yet. But the pain she felt would soon transform into something else, determination. And that's precisely the moment the story takes an unexpected turn. What Clara doesn't realize is that the woman she considered weak and naive possesses more strength than she ever imagined. Stay tuned, because in the next part you'll learn how Helga discovers the first clues, how she finds support, and how the roles of victim and perpetrator begin to shift dramatically. The days following the discovery were as heavy as lead for Helga. She felt empty, burned out, and yet there was this small spark that refused to go out. She could no longer just cry, remain silent, and accept the humiliation. Something inside her resisted, remaining a victim. She looked at the bank statements again and again, and with each glance it became clearer to her. Here not only was a bitter truth about the money written, but here was also the key in her hand. Black on white, complete, irrefutable. But Helga was alone. At least she thought so. Until one afternoon her neighbor Dieter knocked on the door. He was a former postal worker, a few years younger than her. A quiet man who, since his retirement, tended the garden and occasionally helped out in the village when someone didn't understand a form. He had hardly seen Helga in the last few days and sensed something was wrong. "Are you all right, Mrs. Meyer?" he asked cautiously as she opened the door. Helga initially wanted to dismiss it as always, but this time it burst out. Tears streamed down her face as she told Dieter about the deception. She showed him the excerpts, described the conversations with Clara, the lies she had believed. Dieter listened, silently, with a seriousness that reassured Helga. When she was finished, he laid the documents neatly next to each other and said, "You don't have to accept this. You have proof, and you have rights." These words were like a blow, and at the same time a liberation. Never before had anyone spoken to her so clearly, without pity, without mockery, but with clarity and respect. For the first time in weeks, Helga felt that she wasn't completely alone. In the days that followed, Helga and Dieter met more often. They sat at the table, sorted documents, and compared transfers. Dieter patiently explained to her how to make copies, how to organize files, and how to proceed systematically. Little by little, Helga took control of her life again. Every piece of paper she filed felt like a small victory. But it wasn't just about the finances. As they reviewed the documents, Dieter also talked about what had happened. "You're not naive," he said seriously. "You trusted. You believed because you love. That's not weakness. The weakness lies with the one who abuses that trust." These sentences burned into Helga's heart. Maybe he was right. Maybe she wasn't stupid, but simply human. Slowly, a new thought grew within her. What if she didn't let Clara go without saying? What if she, the old, frail woman, found the courage to bring the injustice to light? The next step was difficult, but necessary. Accompanied by Dieter, Helga went to the police station. The journey there felt like marching through a storm. Her knees trembled, her heart pounded. But as she sat in the office and the officers reviewed the documents, she felt an unexpected sense of calm. The facts were clear, the amounts unambiguous, the transfers verifiable. Clara couldn't claim it was a misunderstanding. The officers took the case seriously. "This is fraud," one of them said matter-of-factly, "and not a small one." Helga swallowed. Fraud. The word cut deep, but it was the truth. For the first time, it was no longer just a vague feeling of betrayal, but a clear naming of what had happened. When Helga returned home that evening, she was exhausted, but also relieved. For the first time in a long time, she slept through the night, and the next morning she awoke with a thought that surprised even her. She didn't just want Clara to be brought before the law. She also wanted to look her straight in the eye, wanted Clara to realize that she could no longer hide. This decision led to a moment no one would have expected. A few days later, at a gathering of the extended family, Helga appeared, quiet, unassuming as always. Clara was there too, confident, wearing makeup, with that smile that deceived everyone. But this time, Helga had something in her hand, the documents, neatly arranged, undeniable. When she began speaking to the family, her voice trembled at first, but it quickly gained strength. She recounted the visits, the requests, the sums. She held up the copies, showing transfers, dates, amounts. No screaming, no anger, just clear, calm words. And as she spoke, she felt the power shift. It was no longer Clara who controlled the situation, but herself. Clara tried excuses, tears, and feigned outrage, but this time it didn't work. The evidence was too strong, the truth too clear. And for the first time in months, it was Helga who stood firm, who didn't give in, who didn't let herself be swayed. At that moment, the turning point came. The old woman, who had been considered weak and naive, stood upright before everyone. She had found the courage to defend herself. And the granddaughter, who believed herself untouchable, felt her web of lies tearing apart. But this was just the beginning. What followed was not just a confrontation, but a consequence that would fundamentally change Clara's life and restore Helga's dignity to an extent she herself would hardly have thought possible. Be sure to stay tuned, because in the next part, you will learn how Helga finally gains the upper hand, how Clara is confronted with the consequences of her actions, and how an old woman shows the whole world that strength and courage know no age. The day of truth had arrived. What weeks before had seemed like a distant dream, almost an impossibility, was now imminent. Helga, whom many in the village had long since seen as a broken woman, mentally prepared herself for what was inevitable, the final confrontation and the consequences that would arise from it. It was a cool, clear morning when Helga entered the small entrance hall of the district court with Dita. She wore her best dress, not out of vanity, but to show herself that she wasn't appearing here as a victim, but as a woman of dignity. Dita was silent at her side, but his presence gave her support. She knew, without him, she might never have found the courage. Clara was already waiting in the hall, confident, dressed in expensive clothes, her chin raised, as if she could still control everything. But her eyes betrayed something else, a flickering doubt, a slight tremor that only Helga noticed, for she knew her granddaughter better than she thought. The hearing began objectively and soberly. The judge had the documents examined and asked questions. Helga spoke calmly, describing how it all began, the first visits, the small amounts, the creeping control. Her voice was clear, firmer than she had expected. Clara, on the other hand, wriggled with excuses, tried to create feelings of guilt, spoke of misunderstandings, of supposed generosity, but every sentence bounced off her like waves off a cliff, for the evidence was overwhelming. The longer the hearing lasted, the clearer the picture became. It wasn't a naive old woman who had voluntarily given away her money, but a calculating young woman who had systematically abused trust and placed greed above family. When the judge summed this up in sober terms, Helga felt a wave of relief that brought tears to her eyes. The verdict was clear. Clara had to repay a significant portion of the money, and she also received a fine that shattered her reputation and her future. But more important than any sum for Helga was the recognition. What had been revealed to everyone, to her family, the community, and the law. She was not naive, not ridiculous, not guilty. She was the victim of a fraud, and she had had the courage to fight back. After the trial, the two women stood facing each other. For a moment there was silence. Clara, her eyes now empty, whispered only, "You destroyed everything." But Helga raised her chin and answered calmly, "No, Clara, you destroyed yourself. I only showed the truth." These words resonated not only in Clara's heart, but also in Helga's own soul, for she felt that she had set herself free. The shame, the burden, the constant inner voice that had called her weak, all of that had disappeared. In its place came a new strength, a clarity that she had long thought lost. In the weeks that followed, much changed. The neighbors who had previously whispered about her now greeted her with respect. Some even apologized for having doubted her. Helga accepted these gestures silently, without bitterness, but also without false modesty. She knew she had accomplished something many lack the courage to do. She had stood up when everyone had already given up on her. Dieter stayed by her side, a quiet companion who helped her bring new order into her life. Together, they went through the documents, planned small expenses, and sometimes they simply sat in the garden and enjoyed the peace and quiet. A friendship developed between them that went deeper than mere neighborliness, a bond that gave Helga strength and showed her that new beginnings are possible even in old age. But the most important thing was something else. Helga had her dignity back, not through the money, which she partially saw again, but through the fact that she recognized herself again. She was no longer a woman who bore everything in silence. She was someone who stood up for herself, who clearly stated what was wrong, and who found the courage to bring the truth to light. Sometimes, when she sat alone in her kitchen in the evening, she thought of Clara, of the little girl who used to run laughing through the garden, of the young woman who had at some point put on a mask that concealed her harshness, coldness, and greed. Helga felt no hatred, only sadness, and the realization that love cannot blind. "It's never too late to raise your voice," she thought then, a sentence that stayed with her like a silent vow to herself, and perhaps also a message to all those who believed they were too old, too weak, or too alone to stand up against injustice. For Helga had shown that true strength lies not in youth, not in external power or money, but in dignity that one cannot be deprived of. And this dignity, she now knew, would accompany her until the end of her life. Helga's story shows us that even in old age, one is not powerless. Trust can be betrayed, but dignity and courage can be stronger than any lie. Her granddaughter took her money, but Helga regained something far more valuable, her voice and the respect of her fellow human beings. If you don't want to miss such moving stories like this video, subscribe to the channel and click the bell, because the next story will touch you even more deeply. Check out the other videos. There you'll find more stories full of pain, courage, and surprising twists and turns.